Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the 14th episode of the Caffeine Stream. My name is Chris, and today is an extremely special episode for me personally. I'm speaking with Greg Nagy, a professor at Harvard, a philologist and classicist, and a specialist in Homeric epic and poetry, epic poetry. Basically the star of the field I have been so enamored with these past 3 years in particular, and 10 years more generally. So anyways, without further ado, I give you our conversation. So I am here now with Dr. Greg Nagy, who is, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest Homer scholars and Greek scholars, a rare philologist. You don't see those very often anymore. I don't know if they were ever very common. Is that true?
Well, you know what, Chris, and I hope you call me Greg.
Mm-hmm.
I have the best definition of philology for you.
Okay.
I mean, I'm going to be joking. The really best definition is by Nietzsche.
The Art of Reading Slowly.
Exactly. Oh, you're on top of it. Exactly. But the one that is very funny is, I won't name names, something that was said by a very cantankerous philologist who loved to go to 5 p.m. parties where he would just stare into his drink and sometimes answer a couple of questions by passersby in this swirling party atmosphere. And so there was a blue-haired lady who asked him what he does for a living, and he said, "I'm a philologist." And so she asked, "What is philology?" And he didn't like the question, and he stared into his drink and stared into his drink, and then finally came up with an answer, and then huffed off. And the answer was, this is his definition of philology: "I just look things up." So that's one. Second thing is, I love the way here, Chris, you talked about me as Dr. Nagy or Dr. Greg. And by the way, I'm trying to be so intergenerational that in intellectual contexts, even if it's a 19-year-old college student, I say, "Call me Greg," and then in other situations you can call me anything you want. But and if you were brought up not to say Greg, then you can say Dr. Greg. But Chris, I hope you just call me Greg. But in any case, I think you'll be amused by this story about my time at the Johns Hopkins University from 1973 to 1975. And I was pretty young then, but I was a full professor, and I had been through two kinds of academic experience. One, as a corn-fed Midwesterner in Indiana, where I was a student at Indiana University, and where we, the students, the college students at IU, would address our professors as Dr. X and Dr. Y.
Mm-hmm.
And then for my PhD training, I wound up at Harvard, where that was considered to be very, very provincial. And so what I had to switch to was Mr. X and Mr. Y, and there were no Mrs. X and Mrs. Y, and there was no Ms. X or Ms. Y. It was just Mr. X, Mr. Y. And this Harvard speech habit for me started when I started PhD studies in 1962. eternities ago. And then, as I say, I did a, shall we say, gig at the Johns Hopkins University from 73 to 75. And there, the students, both college students and graduate students, were calling me Dr. Nagy. And I thought, wow, but Johns Hopkins is not provincial, quote unquote. So it turns out that it was reverse snobism.
Oh, interesting.
In the sense that the Johns Hopkins University had a PhD program before Harvard ever dreamed of a PhD program. And so that's why professors there were Dr. X and Dr. Y.
Interesting. It reminds me of that Nietzsche thing about how aristocrats always emphasize and flamboyantly display what is unnecessary as
Yes.
a sign of their
Yes.
their wealth or status. They can
I
go
love
do
it.
hunting, or they can do
I
have
love it.
expansive lawns and call each other Mr. or Doctor.
But by the way, Chris, I love the way Nietzsche, in that definition that you quoted, so you're so well read, the art of reading slowly. It's interesting that he compares that art to the art of a goldsmith.
Hmm.
And then he says at the end, to read slowly, and the English translation that most people use, here's the way it winds up: to read slowly with delicate eyes and fingers.
Hmm.
But in the original German, it's fingers and eyes. The German goes mit zarten Fingern und Augen lesen, with delicate fingers and eyes. And the reason he says fingers first is he's just compared the art of philology to the art of a goldsmith. So a goldsmith needs delicate fingers as well as delicate eyes.
Yeah. And there's something important in that ordering, which
Yeah.
was I mean, Nietzsche, he comes across as someone whose mind is closer to the Homeric poets
Yeah.
than most modern people. Although I could be maybe giving him too much credit, because what struck me when I was reading your passage in particular on the importance of ordering, especially in those first 7 or 12 lines,
Yes.
is that this actually conforms very closely to the rules of good copywriting. If you read a newspaper, you have a
Yes.
heading, then you have a subheading that gives a tiny bit more detail. Then the first paragraph is sort of a summary of the story, and only then do you get into this chronological account.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so,
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I love the way journalists have decided to spell lead differently. It's L-E-D-E, because
yes,
otherwise, if you spell it L-E-A-D, you might make the mistake of saying lead instead of lead, and
yes,
that wouldn't be good. That would be leaden,
yes, not golden, as it were.
not golden, but leaden. No, no,
Mhm.
no.
Yeah, and I love that emphasis on fingers first, because there's a kind of a feeling of judgmentalism that comes across with leading with the eyes, whereas with this tactile approach to exploring the classics with the fingers, there's I imagine a blind person reading a braille sign, like trying to get a dispassionate sensation of what this is like.
I like it.
That
I
sort
like
of
it. Yeah. You know, I could tell you that once I was reading a a work on cognitive psychology by Stephen Koslin, and he was saying that most of us, when we close our eyes and try to imagine something, that what happens to us is that we imagine in 2 dimensions, not in 3 dimensions.
mm,
and I might be misrepresenting what he was arguing, but this is sort of my take on what this work is telling us, is that if you touch something, and you use the word tactile, if you touch something, that enables your cognitive sense of three-dimensional imagination.
Interesting.
And that means that the art of a goldsmith enhances three-dimensional versus two-dimensional imagination when you close your eyes. In other words,
Yes.
when you can't see the outer world as we normally see it.
Yes. I feel like that thematically and symbolically ties in so well to the image of Homer as the blind poet. I know it's controversial and
Oh,
it's mostly
okay.
speculative, but his depiction of the blind poet in the Odyssey on the island of the Phaeacians very still matches that poetic ideal of the man who feels. And it reminds me of this quote from uh Northrop Frye in 1957, where he says, "It is hardly possible to overestimate the importance for Western literature of the Iliad's demonstration that the fall of an enemy, no less than of a friend or leader, is tragic and not comic. With the Iliad once for all, an objective and disinterested element enters into the poet's vision of human life. Without this element, poetry is merely instrumental to various social aims, to propaganda, to amusement, to devotion, to instruction. With it, it acquires the authority that since the Iliad it has never lost, an authority based like the authority of science on the vision of nature as an impersonal order."
Bravissimo. And Northrop Frye was a very accomplished philologist. I so admire his work.
So, one of the sort of related to this concept of objectivity and an almost detached approach to the text, this tactile getting a feel for things. I loved your description of einos in your book as this mode of kind of cryptic speech and the requirement that the listener, in order to understand the meaning of this properly, has to be mentally and morally qualified, and there's a sense in which I think a lot of people will try to read not just the Iliad or the Odyssey, but many old texts with some idea. The Bible comes to mind, especially, of trying to get some kind of confirmation bias out of it. They go in with some idea, and they always seem to fail the Einos test. And
Yes.
it's like you have to, like, the very concept of the Einos is telling us something about not just philology, but how to approach these books in order to get the correct understanding.
Yes, yes. And Chris, when people get consumerist about literature, which is very dangerous, and when they get consumerist about learning and teaching, the temptation is to say, well, how would you rate the Iliad on a scale of 10 to 0, or the Odyssey? And somebody would be tempted to say, well, the Iliad, maybe 7, Odyssey. This depends on the person.
Of course. I was
5.
I was going to ask you the Adam Nichols question at some point. The are you an Iliad person or an Odyssey question?
Well, yes. Let's keep that hanging for the time,
Right.
because even in the next few minutes, I may change what I say or what I was planning to say. So, so the thing about looking at something like the Iliad or the Odyssey, how would you rate it? Well, the problem is that in real life, you're not rating it. It
No.
is rating you.
Yes. Yes.
And And I love to say to people, whatever generation they belong to, we're all students. So um, I like to say that it's so important when you see something great like the Iliad or the Odyssey, is not to read your values into it,
Hmm.
but to try to read out of it.
Yes.
And it'll never work perfectly, but you just keep trying.
Well, because our eyes are, and even our fingers are subjective instruments. We can only grasp one surface of this three-dimensional thing at a time.
Yes.
But I love the visual you put in, I believe it was chapter 7, the framing of these images on these vases and amphoras
Yes.
depicts a kind of portal, and it's not just a one-way
Oh no,
glass.
that's
So,
right. And I really enjoyed reading the two essays you shared with me the other day. Um, and may I make comments on especially the first one where you talk about theoria, which is almost
mhm,
impossible to translate
yeah.
into English.
Which, as an aside, is one of the important points about learning these Greek words that are at the root of our English, but are not really a conventional part of it. So much
Exactly.
is
Exactly.
lost there.
Exactly. So I really like the way you grappled with that and how something like contemplation is a a a very lifelong process. It's life itself. So
Hmm.
um, so that said, going back to the question of the Iliad or the Odyssey and the kind of predisposition that you need to engage with the Iliad and the Odyssey. You mentioned two of the three qualifications that I think you need to have. You mentioned
Yes.
oh, and you mentioned moral, but I would also add emotional.
Mm.
And
I knew there was one I was forgetting.
no, you weren't forgetting it because in a sense, in a sense, these three words, mental, moral, and emotional, they're not quite symmetrical with each other. Mental is too broad. Uh, Emotional can just veer off into all sorts of things that we're not talking about here.
Hmm.
But I'm talking, maybe it's easier to say it negatively. You cannot be alienated.
Yes, it almost implies that that nous, that mental connection, is required to understand what the other person is saying, and and
Exactly.
and these competencies are often the source not of like I'm a skillful enough writer or a skillful enough electrician or a skillful enough bodybuilder to understand what you're saying, but I have pursued these activities in a way that you have too, such that our shared experience provides a framework for mutual comprehension.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. And can we go back to blindness or being
Yes.
sightless? Um, this is something that is not in the things of mine that you have read. So if you're saying, where did this come from? It comes from elsewhere. But I'm fascinated with myths about how Homer became blind.
Mm.
And you understand that because I strongly sense that anthropology is a vitally needed aspect of our approach to something like Homeric poetry. So as long as you let me be anthropological for a minute,
Of course. Yeah.
yeah, and then I would like to talk about um, reception. That is to say, in an oral tradition, that is to say, where you don't depend on the technology of writing, either for the composition or for the taking in of whatever is composed, because it's all in performance.
Hmm.
When you're thinking of a medium like that, where reception is everything, where are you going to connect or not connect with something? And if you think of myth not as something that's made up by an individual, but a system of thinking that a whole society or a subsection of society um, lives by.
Yeah, they participate in it.
I said that lives
Yeah.
by. I didn't say believes in.
Right.
That you specialize myths that you live by. That is to say, narratives. I worry about the word story because story for English speakers today, um, like myth, um, those words like that imply something that is not believable. But we're not talking about belief systems. We're talking about um, patterns of, I'll just say narrative. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Patterns of narrative that societies live by. So if you think of these beautiful myths, which are always local in the ancient Greek experience, about Homer as a person and the life of Homer. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not going to try to prove that there really was a person called Homer, a person who's like you and me. No, no, no. Um,
He's almost a god in his own
uh, uh,
right, in a sense.
let's say a superhuman.
Yes, yes.
Uh, uh,
Yeah.
um, um, then I would just like to summarize for you one myth where Helen, who was worshipped as a goddess in some Greek communities, but not in other Greek communities, and our Iliad is clearly um, shall we say, expression of a community that did not worship Helen as a goddess. But there were people out there in locales who did worship her as a goddess. And I want you to imagine Helen appearing to Homer in a dream. And I'm going to say this in colloquial American English of today. Helen says to Homer in the dream, "You bastard, you defamed me. You ruined my reputation. Take it back. And if you don't take it back, I'll strike you blind." And I'm not retelling the myth properly, but basically, um, he's struck blind, and obviously he doesn't take it back.
I love
Because,
it. Yeah. On the one hand, he's like this perfect, like ethical journalist,
yes,
or at least the ideal who sticks with his story. On the other hand, what I was reading just a few months ago actually was that Helen has some etymological relationship with Helios and with the sun. Is that true?
possibly. And Chris, we've got to make a placeholder for the sun, the SUN.
Yes. Ah,
Uh,
yes.
because in your second essay, I know you're very interested in what is sometimes derided as solar mythology, but I don't deride it.
Hmm.
So let's get back to that placeholder.
Sure. Hmm.
But there's another side of the coin to this myth that I told you. There's another myth about a master not of epic but of lyric, and the name of this master is Stesichorus. It doesn't matter what his name is for our purposes now,
Hmm.
but there's a parallel myth where um, it's Stesichorus who is asleep and dreaming, and Helen appears to Stesichorus. Stesichorus comes from a community that does worship Helen as a goddess. So here's the dream. You bastard, you defame me, take it back. And he takes it back.
Oh,
And he had been struck blind, but then his vision is restored.
interesting.
So think about that for a while. There are many ways to go with this, but there it is.
Yeah. And it's yeah, very interesting because it ties back with that the disinterested quality of poetry from or reading for that matter with the fingers, with a goldsmith's fingers, as opposed to poetry by sight. The it's as if the disinterested objectivity is physically embodied in you once you've decided to be disinterested in the face of the gods. Oh, you're going to be disinterested. Well, here go your judging eyes. Especially from a beautiful goddess.
I like that take. I like that take. And by the way, how do we imagine the beauty of Helen? It's not easy.
No, no. No, but so many of these depictions of the great characters in both the Iliad and the Odyssey connote radiance and shining and brilliance,
Yes.
and reflecting the glory of the sky in that way. And
Oh,
so,
beautiful, Chris. Beautiful. I'm sorry I interrupted you with
oh no, you're fine.
my cries of admiration, but I like the way you said that. I hope we don't edit that out. I interrupted you with expressions of admiration for what you
Oh
just.
no, you're fine.
I have to confess to you is I was trained as a linguist
Mhm.
before anything else, and I got into this field by way of descriptive linguistics, and only from there did I go on to historical linguistics for
Mm.
this lengthy life of mine. And historical linguistics is very tricky about how you reconstruct things. And I don't
Mm.
want to be Debbie Downer about etymologies that don't work, because there's such a thing as folk etymology, where in a given time and place, historically, even if a linguist would tell the person who is etymologizing, no, that doesn't work because I know what the forms were like
What the rules are,
500
yeah.
years earlier or whatever. There is such a thing as, some people call it condescendingly, folk etymology, but a more sophisticated way of referring to it is synchronic etymology. That is to say, what are the associations that come to mind in current usage of a word? So I come
Oh,
back to you.
so what's that Platonic dialogue where he's talking about language? There's a dialogue where Socrates,
The Cratylus, yeah.
Cratylus, yes, where at the root of it is, what does the sound invoke in
Yes.
terms of our emotional
And Chris,
impression?
I can tell you that a specialist in Indo-European linguistics will look at the Cratylus, and I'm making up this statistic, but they'll say this is 95% wrong. Doesn't matter in a sense, because the person
Yeah.
who is manipulating words, the mind that's manipulating words in the Cratylus, knows the Greek language better than anybody today will know it. I mean, the ancient
Yes.
language. So
Yeah.
come on.
It's not like someone who's trying to create a new phrase for this new idea says, well, what rules of linguistics do I need to follow to properly produce the correct sound in
There you
association
go.
with this?
There you
Yeah.
go. There you go. I wasn't just being polite. I was being understanding that there are word associations that may have clicked synchronically, but I'm still going to leave it at that in
Sure.
this particular case. Um, for Germanic myths, um, I am a big fan of one particular character called Starkadr. That's the way the name is pronounced in Old Norse. When Old Norse sophisticates try to explain this to other sophisticates by using medieval Latin, which was a way to show off your knowledge, it's Starkatherus.
Mm.
And Chris, I think you would really enjoy reading a a uh, a huge compendium of Danish myths
Mm.
by somebody called Saxo Grammaticus.
Saxogram. I
And
feel like I've heard that name before.
Grammaticus does not mean grammarian
Right. Yeah.
means the equivalent of a tenured professor, highest grade.
Okay. I'll have to look that up. I've been adding to my reading list uh, faster than I can go through it. The I'm working through Roy Rappaport at the moment, one of his works, and I'm after that comes the Rig Veda, and then who knows
Oh,
what from there.
kidding. Excellent, excellent.
So,
So the thing is, I so encourage you to be a comparatist,
oh yeah. Mhm.
and it's very important to be a comparatist. And so, in a situation like this, where you engage with a linguist who's been at it since, I don't know, age 18 or whatever, um, of course, I'll say, well, this etymology doesn't work, but this one does work, or semi-hemi-demi works, if you think of synchronic etymologies. I
Yeah.
mean, look, in my book, Best of the Achaeans, a lot of it is argumentation to show that the name of Achilles means he who has sorrow for the people. But I don't insist in my argumentation that that meaning can be reconstructed as far back as you can possibly go as a comparative linguist.
Right. Right.
There's a stage in Homeric poetry, which, as you know, because I've read you, the Homeric poetry is a language, a meta language, which has its own rules. Milman Parry and Albert Lord call those rules formulaic system. Uh,
Hmm.
Within those rules, it's very clear, I think, and I, I think I can prove it, that Achilles does mean he who has sorrow for the people in terms of the system of what Milman Parry used to call Homeric diction. In other words, in the grammar of Homeric poetry, that's what the name means. But if I say that to somebody who simply tries to reconstruct Indo-European languages as far back as they can go, I'm not insisting that you can go all the way back, but there's no such thing as all the way back.
Right. What comes before Proto-Indo-European? There's maybe
Exactly.
Proto-Uralic or who knows what.
And by the way, that's where comparative linguistics as a discipline breaks down. Indo-Europeanists have done a pretty good job of reconstructing uh, to a degree, but once it goes beyond what they call Indo-European, which I don't really like as a term, but it's better than Indo-Germanic.
Hmm.
But once they try to get something like a synchrony, reconstruct a synchrony for that, which isn't attested anywhere, so it's just a model. Um, you can't go further back.
Yes, and there's also a degree of to use a somewhat controversial concept of emergentism required in understanding some of these things. If you were to try to understand English beginning with Beowulf, which is a wonderful,
Oh
place to
yeah,
start, but so much Greek and Latin and even French and other elements have come into English. If your understanding of English, the true root of English is only in Beowulf, the to the point where the wonderful works of Shakespeare become a kind of pollution of the pure form. At some point, you're missing something really cool
yes, yes.
um, from that.
Chris, one thing that would really help our conversation, and not now, we can go to other things
Hmm.
because I bet you have lots of questions that I'm choking off by talking so much.
Oh no, this is wonderful. But carry on.
But let me put it this way. I did try to write an article called the title is misleading, The Epic Hero, where I have a very good introduction about different methods of comparing things. And I want to send you a link to that.
Sure.
And to any of your friends who are participating in in the kind of medium we're participating in now. I don't know how to do that, how to send a URL, but you can figure that out.
Oh yeah,
Anyway, there's one kind of comparison that's called typological by some linguists.
Mhm.
Typological comparison is where you know for a fact that two languages are not related to each other, but they still undergo processes that are good to compare with each other because, oh, so that's the way they did it. So they're not related. They're not related either by way of borrowing or by way of common inheritance. They just look the same. And it turns out that because language is a system, um, you can start getting pretty good at predicting what a system, wherever it is, whatever the historical background is, um,
Yeah.
capable of doing, how it's capable of evolving.
If I remember correctly, that's what David Anthony was talking about at the beginning of The Horse, the Wheel, and Language in how linguists come up with their rules of how languages evolve across time with that kind of, is that correct? I
That's
believe.
exactly correct. And this will be a kind of a good way for us to communicate further
Mhm.
about methods of reconstruction, especially Indo-European linguistics.
Yeah. Well, and I think even beyond just the linguistic stuff to your theory of Achilles as the sorrow of the people, there's there's a narrative element where someone who reads maybe a Fagles or another English translation of the Iliad can just see that that is whether or not that's the like iron proof demonstrable in the etymology. That's clearly what he represents in the story as this man who's enduring
Exactly.
this incredible sorrow, not only for being denied his birthright, but also for seeing his best friend and his other
Exactly.
self die like that. That is the you can't depict that more clearly in the context of the
Yeah,
story.
exactly. We're on the same page. But as I'm saying, I think you would be interested in, for example, how somebody like me goes about saying, okay, there's this Old Norse hero who is chronicled in Saxo Grammaticus and in this huge medieval Latin retelling of Old Norse myth.
Mm-hmm.
And you take somebody like Starkadr, whose name sort of means strong man, and compare him with Heracles, which I've been doing in a book project all summer. And I can show you the rudiments of it because it's already online.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and you'll see that, uh, wow, an Indo-Europeanist, even if I'm squeamish about a given etymology that somebody has been working on. Um, the point is that Indo-European linguistics can show that there is a shared inheritance by way of language, and that comparing Starkadr, the Old Norse hero, the Germanic hero, with Heracles, the Greek hero, is not only worth doing, it gives you not just dozens, but hundreds and thousands of insights about both these mythological figures in their respective myths.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now,
Interesting.
because time marches on and we have put solar mythology on hold,
Ah,
why don't I
yes.
give you a chance to talk about your take on solar mythology, and then I'll try to sort of work around it.
Sure. Well, I have a friend, excellent writer as well, who's been exploring this concept for personal reasons. Like atheism was sort of a non-starter, and then but he wasn't really buying into to Christianity, and the concept of the sun as this center, as this model for for life and creation and emanating order outward was very compelling to him. So that led to for a number of his acquaintances, myself included, what does that actually entail? And I guess the normal go-to example is the Roman Sol Invictus, which is this very martial, conquering
Yes.
force. And so that's sort of what most people, I guess, when they hear this concept, go to first. But then, as is so often the case with exploring these things with goldsmith's fingers rather than just trying to figure out,
Yeah.
find confirmation for your own initial opinions. The Odyssey in particular seemed to have a very different take. And it's one that's juxtaposed with what you see in the Iliad, where all these heroes are trying to pursue glory and land among the stars by just going up against them in a way. I'm going to put my name in song forever by picking a fight with a god, and I'm going to die immediately, but it'll be worth it. Whereas the Odyssey, which feels in many ways more explicitly about the sun, with that Helios or Hyperion, the book seems to equivocate the two, seems to interchange the two. It has this sort of, it begins with due respect instead, and instead of trying to fight the gods, what are the appropriate sacrifices I need to make? What is the appropriate, what if I make peace with the gods and with the powers, the greater powers of this world, and then they will, shine on me and help me in my journey home. It's an almost inversion of the classical kid story of the north wind and the sun trying to get the man to take his coat off. It's that, but the other way around.
I really like what you said, and could I just add to it that you're leading into a good way for us to start winding up when it comes to what is your favorite epic, Iliad or the Odyssey?
Yes,
because here you are essentially comparing what seems to be a set of two different worldviews. And let me just say, especially with reference to the Odyssey, that the work of Douglas Frame, which is very rigorously linguistics centered. His work, at least to my mind, proves that two key words in the Odyssey, and I do talk about it a little bit, with deference to Doug Frame in the Ancient Greek Hero book, are the two key words are nostos, which is usually defined as homecoming or return, and nous, which is usually defined as mind. And as a linguist, as a certified linguist, I can say that I'm betting that Douglas Frame's argumentation is valid, and that both these words, one having to do with the physical process, which can turn into mental and spiritual, of returning to something, and that other word, nous, which is usually translated as mind, but maybe it would be better to translate it as consciousness, that these two words actually come from one concept, which is, are you ready? Return to light and life.
Yes,
which is solar. That's as solar as you can get.
Yes, it is. And it reminds me of the sort of in the negative, the opening line of the this caught my eye in your translation of those opening lines of the Odyssey.
Yes.
It says, the blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun. That blind fools, I'd have to look at your book to remember the
Well,
exact word for that, but
I can do that
it
because
was like children or something.
that's more Fagels and less Greg.
Yes.
So here's the thing. Let's go, and this will actually lead very nicely, I think, into, hey, Chris, are you an Iliad person or an Odyssey person? Where I bet you can't answer it.
Right. Well, it's a funny question, and I've asked a few coworkers who are also into the classics. They do exist in construction, believe it or not.
Oh, I do believe it.
And I'll ask them, so are you sort of an Odyssey person or an Iliad person? And the ones who've read them will usually laugh. It's a joke to them. They're like, and it's
Exactly.
funny because it so clearly captures that there is that distinction, and so many, especially I feel like so many young guys are gung-ho about the Iliad. When I was going to truck driving school in Minnesota, I was camping for
Yes,
5 or 6 weeks, and I would get home from school, bike back, go for a little walk, and just read the Iliad. It was like very
Wow.
compelling to this young,
Yes.
20, 22, 23-year-old guy. Whereas I think as people get older, the
Oh yeah.
the Odyssey
Oh yeah.
connects a little bit more.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Yes. So with those thoughts in mind, and again, I go back to Doug Frame's um, um, trying to reconstruct a basic meaning from which other meanings can be explained, return to light and life, which has to do with, of course, sunrise after sunset.
Mm-hmm.
You notice
Yes.
of course,
Yeah, there's a circularity to that. Yeah.
and how it's a matter of consciousness. Well, here's where myth has this wonderful chicken and egg way about it. And you mentioned the Rig Veda earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the best things you can do is learn Sanskrit and just read the Rig Veda over and over and over again and compare it with the Iliad and Odyssey. So that's going to be your next mission. But basically, when a priest in the Vedic view of the world and of life, when the priest prays for consciousness, which means uh, I've been asleep, but I want to wake up, or I'm dead and I want to be resurrected, or whatever,
Mm.
or I fainted and I want to come to. You like by the way, the translation "come to"?
Yes.
When a priest in Vedic traditions prays like that, it is I want to wake up. In a sense, he has to wake up in order to pray for the sun to rise.
Oh, so how can you pray if you are asleep, if you are not already awake?
There you go. And this is this is a big problem for myth in general, and this is why
Yeah.
you might enjoy reading this. There are myths where a god is praying.
Well, so
Or
then
a
is
god
there
is
some
sacrificing.
significance to, and I'm like read the first page of the Rig Veda just out of curiosity when it arrived. It's upstairs in my room. But it describes Agni as the first priest. And
It
this,
says Agni Mile Purohitam. I
yes,
pray to Agni, the priest.
yes. And so this notion of fire as connected to the role of the priest. Fire is in some sense a proto sun. This
Yes,
thing that sheds light in a circle around it, and it by spreading
yes,
its light, it establishes order in the model of the sun, never matching the sun, but
yes,
in a
yes,
similar
yes.
way.
You know what, Chris? What you might enjoy is I have an essay where I have an essay where I try um, to summarize everything that Doug Frame has worked on in
Ooh,
pages, and it's in a book called Greek Mythology and Poetics. And there I really get into Agni, and what you just said, I totally agree with. Agni is the microcosm and macrocosm of solar mythology.
mm-hmm. which means I have to add Heraclitus to my reading list as well.
Oh, you bet. Well, the sad thing is there's not that much left of him.
Yes, but it's the great thing about all of these works is that they're like they're like bottomless wells. You can just keep going back, and there's
Oh yeah.
always
Oh yeah.
more there, which is maybe related to that endless return.
Yes, yes. And so hey Chris,
Mhm.
I'm going to turn things around and I'm interviewing you now.
Okay.
So today, this hour, are you an Iliad person or an Odyssey person?
Oh man, I was an Iliad person all through my 20s. I think for the last year and a half, 2 years, I've been an Odyssey person. I don't know how long that phase will continue on. But there are, I have to say, in reading that first page of the Rig Veda, there's a connection to the Iliad that sort of reignites
Oh yes.
and
Oh, did you
puts you
say,
in that mood again.
my God, Chris, you said reignites. Did you know that Latin ignis is cognate with agni?
No, I did not. But now that you've mentioned it, it appears so obvious. So it's
It's
right there in
really
front of you.
true. It's there. And you see Indo-European etymology studies are where you should go.
Yeah. And this is the reason I think we're coming up on an hour here. And I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but for me, this is the moments like that are why I want more people to read Homer and to understand the Greek, because it so enriches your understanding even of English and of
Oh,
our culture and
oh yeah.
religion. You get these little moments of connection. I love all translations of the Iliad
Oh,
that when they translate He muri akaios, they translate that muri into myriad.
oh,
Because
it's
it
very
because
good.
it's it's the same word. When they say like many or countless, it's like, okay, we're getting the word. But when you translate muri into myriad, it's bringing the Greek into the modern our understanding in a way that is that's, to borrow a metaphor, tactile. You
Well,
feel it.
you know what? Again, I'm not the kind of person who says, "Oh, it's 12:01 Eastern Standard Time. We must stop now." So
Oh, of course,
we
yes.
can spill over as definitely spill over. But let me offer you a really interesting spillover that deals with Indo-European linguistics.
Mhm.
So when you look up Murioi or Muria in a Greek to English dictionary, I mean ancient Greek, the first definition will be 10,000. The second definition will be lots and lots, bunches and bunches. Um, and I'll let you sort of start thinking about which came earlier and which came later.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that linguists have found the cognate, and by cognate I mean a parallel form in a parallel language, where by common inheritance you see words that need to be compared and that you can reconstruct back to this non-existent construct called Indo-European. And the language that I'm looking for now is Hittite, which
Oh,
was the premier language of the Hittite Empire in the second millennium BCE. And there, the word muri, which is cognate, I'm quite sure. In other words, it's not mutual influence, it's just common inheritance. The word muri in Hittite means, get this, bunch of grapes.
oh man. What?
Think, think about it. So it's bunches and bunches of disembodied conveyors of identity that are sent to whatever Hades is in the beginning of the Iliad.
it's hard to overlook the pun in the translation of bunches and bunches in the but that's
But
that's
I'm
fascinating.
saying myriad is much better because then we're paying homage to the transmission of classicism in the English language. I
Yes.
understand.
Well, and it's so valuable if nous if this mental connection um is some gateway to experiencing life better,
Yeah.
which I'm convinced that it is.
Oh, yes.
It's hard to connect with these ancient texts without connecting with the language through which they're
Exactly.
constructed. And
Exactly.
with things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, understanding them, in a circumlocuting fashion, closer and closer, never quite reaching the true essence, but in increasing degrees of accuracy and
I
curiosity,
like
it feels like it builds a greater understanding of where we are now, which is not just
it.
linguistically but culturally built
Yes.
upon this foundation that you go through, not you as a philologist, but
But
most of us
one.
go through go
Yes.
through our lives without really understanding.
Oh,
And the
but count me in too, Chris. No, no, we're all in the same boat.
mhm. Ever
And
since the Library of Alexandria burned down, we're all in the same boat.
well, oh, I don't want to be a smart
a,
aleck,
a
but
joke.
it turns out that what we think of in terms of Plutarch's narrative was not a burn down of the library. It was just a shipping dock where a bunch of books in transit were burned. That's
Ah,
what some smart aleck historians will now say. So the destruction of the library is a more gradual and complicated thing.
gotcha.
But
I see.
that's being a smart aleck, and you notice I said smart aleck. I didn't use other words.
Yes, of course. Leave it to the linguist to be precise in that way. Well, excellent. I want to, earlier you said that I hope I can bring this up here and not have to edit this out later, but you said it was important that we do this, not for money. And I want to point out to anyone listening to this that Greg Nagy's work is not just top tier, but it's all of it or almost all of it is available online for free. The Center for Hellenic Studies is this unbelievable library of incredible content. I believe Leonard Molnar's work is there as well,
Yes,
and
yes, it
and
is.
all kinds of excellent work. I I I had to. Oh, I didn't actually choose to buy this. My bibliophile uncle sent this to me five
What?
years ago, and two
How
two and a half
wonderful.
years ago, I finally got around to reading it, and I was like, "This is incredible." And then I went and bought the Best of the Achaeans and a few and Molnar's work after it was mentioned in here, and a
Yes.
few others. So I cannot recommend highly enough that everyone go and check out the Center for Hellenic Studies, and also the what is that website? There
Oh,
the is it Tufts Universities? Uh
Perseus, exactly.
yes,
If people go to Perseus and Tufts University, they will find an amazing database built by Gregory Crane, another Gregory, who
hmm
was my student way back when, and who founded Perseus by way of a grant from the Annenberg Foundation, by way of a grant from the Annenberg Foundation. Um, Annenberg was the man who ran TV Guide, and most of your friends won't even know what TV Guide is. It's so long ago,
right.
and there's this silly film that I really like. I think the first or the second or third Austin Powers film, where there's somebody who's been deep frozen uh, comes back to uh, an unfrozen status, but doesn't understand what the value of money is, and tries to hold the world hostage for $1 million. And Greg Crane got a grant from the Annenberg Foundation to the tune of, I think it was $1 million, to found Perseus, which is this amazing instrument that you, dear Chris, have just told your friends about. But one thing that I would also like to advertise, and advertise is the wrong word because there's nothing involving money here, is another website called Classical Continuum. Since I'm an old man, I'm no longer director of the Center for Hellenic Studies, and everything that I've done is being mirrored in a new website called Classical Continuum, where you will see, dear Chris, all my new things, for example, comparing Germanic heroes with Greek heroes.
Oh, fantastic.
Classical Continuum.
I'll put links to all of this in the
Yes.
description here.
And although your uncle was very generous to buy that book for you, it's online for free at both the Center for Hellenic Studies and at Classical Continuum. And so are the books of Leonard Milner and Douglas Frame.
So when you recommended Douglas Frame, the first thing I did was I went to Amazon and I almost bought one of his books for $80.
No,
I
don't do
might in the future, but I found the hyperlink and I'm like, I maybe
Perfect.
don't have $80 to spend at this moment. But
Absolutely. And no, I would, you would make Doug happy if you simply read it online. I know that some people don't like to read online. For example, you can't take a book to the bathtub with you if you want to read it online.
Right.
It seems dangerous, but I totally agree with you. Everything that I'm asking people to read from me is available online for free.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful project. This whole project of understanding the languages of the past and this poetry, and it's this thing that's to go back to your description of how myths were participated in and not just believed. The understanding the past isn't something we believe, but it is something you can participate in.
Yes.
In talking with people, writing essays, reading these wonderful books that so many people have put out there. And it's maybe not the same as, sacrificing a goat and offering mead to the dead souls underworld, but it is a kind of participation in this thing we've inherited.
What a beautiful way to draw this to a close. And I can just give you a footnote: return to light and life.
Yes. Greg, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. Everyone who's listening, go out and read his stuff. I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Thank you, Chris.
Truly fantastic work. Thanks so much for.
You have a great mind and keep on doing what you're doing. I so support you.
Thank you so much, Greg. You too.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.